Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Jans, the co-founder of Writing Launch, and thank you for being here and welcome to today's webinar. We are very excited to have you today for the Grow Your Writing Income workshop. These 3 days are going to be jam-packed with actionable information that you can use to grow your writing income. You'll be getting real-world case studies, a concrete template for getting more clients, quite a lot of tools, tricks, secrets, and techniques for getting paid to write so you can grow your income as a writer. Let's start by talking about our instructor today, Ian Chandler. He started out, like a lot of writers, he was writing for a content mill and he was able to pay a few bills, but it was a grind. It was no fun. Content mills are just not a lot of fun, but he stopped writing for the content mills, and as soon as he stopped that, he immediately started making more money. But still, he had a lot of trial and error that he had to go through. He didn't know how to talk to clients. He didn't know the basics of marketing. He didn't know how to set rates, how to get work, or even where to look to find good clients. And those are all really common questions that so many writers have. And he, through trial and error, just through his relentless pursuit of his writing career, he figured out the answer to all of those questions. And ever since he quit the content mills and just really focused on growing his income as a writer, his income has just steadily gone up. And that's how I found him. I'm the editor of Freedom with Writing, and he sent me a pitch, and I accepted his pitch, and we've been sort of working together ever since. And we started Writing Launch in a large part because we want you to have the answers to that question, those questions about how to grow your income and build your career in the right way so that you don't have to struggle, and so that you can move forward confidently. So pay attention to what Ian has to say today. It's the result of hard-earned experience. He's giving you the training that he wishes he had when he started out. So here is Ian Chandler.
Thank you, Jacob. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the day one of the workshop. We're really excited to put this on. I want to talk about the workshop really quick and how it's going to be laid out before we begin today's webinar. Today is going to be a live webinar that's going to go over how to communicate your value, and it's going to talk a lot about just how to make more money with writing. And then tomorrow and the day after, you're going to get 2 videos, one on each day, and a free download as well. And we're not going to spoil the surprise of those too much, but just to give you an idea, that's what to expect. So today, for this webinar, I wanted to focus on how to start where you are and make more money doing what you're already doing. Because I think a lot of writers think that in order to make more money, they really have to, hustle, put a lot of work in, hour after hour of work. And it's really not that difficult unless you make it. And that's something I've learned after just years of writing. It's not something that came naturally to me. In fact, when I started out, after I left the content mill, I remember I was still putting in a lot of work, and I was just it wasn't that edifying. I felt like I was just working a regular job. And over time, I've learned to cut back on the actual amount of work I'm doing and still maintain a profit margin. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about to you today, how to get there. So I'll pull up the slides, and then we can get started.
I want to add that there will be a Q&A session at the end for everyone who's able to be here for the live recording. So think of questions that you might have and ask them in the comments, and we'll get to them. Or if you are watching the recorded version of this, feel free to send an email to support@writinglaunch.com, and we will reply to you with our answers to your questions. And we're really here to help our fellow writers. So any questions that you have about what we're talking about, please do ask.
All right, well, let's get started. So the title of the workshop is Grow Your Writing Income, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. The big question is just that: how do you grow your writing income? there are basically two major steps that I've noticed myself taking, and from talking with other writers, this is also the process that they go through more or less. The first step is to create and cultivate the right mindset. And I know that might sound a little pseudoscience-y, but there is a lot of truth to that, and I'll go into that in just a moment. And then you have to use that mindset to take action. And we're going to be discussing a lot of actionable tips today that you can go out and do right after the webinar. Before any of that, I wanted to address some objections. I've gotten a lot of comments, heard from a lot of writers that they just can't make that as much money writing because ... And these are just, the problems that writers face when trying to make more money doing what they love to do. One of the very common ones is, I don't have enough time. People think that, like I said a moment ago, that you need, to hustle and put hours and hours of work in every day, work, 50, 60 hours a week, and just to make ends meet and make a little bit of profit. And really, that's not the case. You don't need hours per day to create a lucrative career. In fact, if you only have 30 minutes each day, you can do it. Just think about that. That's a half hour every day, a half hour out of a 24-hour period. And that's still enough for you to create and grow a lucrative writing career. I know that might sound crazy to some of you, and it definitely seemed crazy to me at one point, but that's definitely possible. So I wanted to kind of give you that as a ballpark of, how little time you can actually spend in order to grow a career. Another common objection is, oh, I'm having trouble finding clients. I don't know where to look for work. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And in short, getting good clients is all about knowing where to look. And it's also knowing about how to communicate with them. And we're going to be talking about that a lot today. Another really, really common one that I've heard is, oh, I can't make that much money because I don't have that any experience. And I think this is sort of a beginner's syndrome type of thing. And by that, I mean, you don't have to be brand new to freelance writing to feel this way. You could be writing for years and still feel this way. And I think that's because in the traditional workplace, there's such an emphasis on, experience and climbing the corporate ladder and sort of moving forward after you've passed, some milestones in your career. But with freelancing, one of the great things is that you could theoretically start off making $1 per word if you know how to communicate your value. And I think that's part of why I love freelancing. You really do need zero experience to get started. I certainly started out with almost zero experience. I had, no writing samples or anything outside of academic writing, which is, useless for freelance writing. And I tell writers this all the time. The only thing you need is the ability to write well. That's it. That's all you need. And, internet access, which if you're watching this, you have. So think about that, kind of let that stew in your brain for a little bit. Don't let all these roadblocks or perceived roadblocks get in the way of your career. Don't let them stop you from, having that ambition to follow through, because that can really be disastrous to a career. And before we begin, there's just one note that I wanted to start on. I've gotten so many messages. I've talked with so many writers, both in email, on social networks, about Contentmills, and I've seen so many people think that they have to praise Contentmills or freelancing platforms, and there's a little bit of difference between the two, but we won't go into that today. Just kind of group them in the one category mentally. And I really have to recommend that you strongly consider ditching those for good. And the reason is that, as we'll see in a few moments, they are just so prohibitive to building a career. In fact, I personally think they're one of the worst things you can do to try to grow your career. They hinder your forward movement. And I wrote for a freelancing platform at one point, when I started out, and as Jacob said, it was crazy how within, I'd say, about a month of leaving that platform, I was making way more money than I ever made, and I was having a better time, and I was choosing the jobs that I wanted to work on. And I really have to implore you to leave those behind for good. And I know it's scary, but these places just don't make sense with a growth-based mindset that we're going to talk about. So think about that as we go forward, and I hope you'll see that if you embody all of the values and the steps that we're going to talk about today, you will not have to rely on these horrible places anymore. And if you have any doubts or reservations about your own ability or about anything else, try to leave those behind for good too, at least just for this webinar. Try to imagine a better future for yourself in which you don't have to work for the Contentmills, or you don't feel doubtful about yourself, because really it doesn't take any special talent or any it doesn't take lots of money or anything like that. Literally anyone can do it, and that includes you. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So I want to talk about having a growth mindset, and this is something that you'll often see in business context, and a lot of entrepreneurs will talk about this. And the weird thing is that it really seems counterintuitive at first, but it can yield great results. And that's because it goes against the grain of what we've been taught over the last 100 years, that kind of social and workplace narrative that you start at the bottom, you work your way up, and you have to do certain things to get to where you want to be. Because I think that could be compared to waiting in line somewhere. Whereas I think with freelancing, that's a great example of being able to jump the line. So I want to talk about how to develop a growth mindset really quickly, and then we'll jump into how you can use it to better your writing career. Some elements of the growth mindset, it's strategic. And what I mean by that is you have to selectively take on work. If you're having trouble finding jobs right now, I know that sounds like crazy talk. Why would I want to selectively take on work when I barely can get any? But in reality, settling for any job that you're going to get thrown at you it's really prohibitive to your career for several reasons. One of I think the biggest is that if you just take any job without questioning it just because you're desperate for work, then you will not get the most profit from that job. You'll be working harder on it. You probably won't enjoy it as much. So you do have to be strategic. And if you selectively take on your work, you'll find that you're more satisfied with it and you'll make more money. It also involves reducing work, because ideally, and we'll talk about this later, you want to reduce the amount of work that you do while maximizing the amount of profit you get. And you need to focus on both the present and the future. And I talk about that in terms of a cost-benefit ratio. Whenever you're doing a project or doing any writing, you're paying a cost, and that's your time and your energy. And the benefit is the money you'll receive, and possibly any future opportunities. So you have to think about how that interacts, what the ratio is. Is the cost greater? Is the benefit greater? Are they equal? Is the job worth it? Things of that nature. So that's a few elements to keep in mind. So now that we've talked about that, and hopefully you're kind of in that zone, let's talk about looking for work. Something that I think freelance writers have a hard time really thinking about, and thinking about this in a tangible way, is the fact that you choose your work and not the other way around. I see so many freelancers, who are so desperate for jobs, and that's understandable. I've been there. I think we all have. It's easy to become so desperate for jobs that you will literally just take whatever gets thrown at you. But that's sort of, that's why we're freelance writers, right? We want to be freelance writers, at least in part because of the freedom of being able to do what we want and to create the kind of career that we want for ourselves. So, for some of us, that might mean taking on a lot of work and keeping our plate full. For others, that might, be working, 6 hours per week if we can. But the bottom line is that you are in control of the work you get and how your career turns out. And your work does not have to choose you. So keep that in mind. I think that can be very powerful if you let it roll around in your brain and realize the power of that statement. And like I said before, settling for just any old job is going to slow down your career. You'll spend more time working on work that you really don't want to be doing, and that takes up a lot of your time and energy, and you won't be getting any farther in your career. And like I mentioned before, you absolutely have to get off of Contentmills and freelancing platforms. I've talked with some writers who are at the top of their game, and they don't use Contentmills or freelancing platforms, and there's a reason why. The best writers in the world do not use these, and that's because they're finding better ways to make money that are better and more lucrative for them. And as I mentioned with the cost-benefit ratio, you got to be strategic. Which jobs are going to give you a good return on your investment? And I think that's an important way to think about the work you do. Your work, every word that you write is an investment in your future. So think about how much you're going to get from it and if it's worth it or not. And like I said, the cost-benefit ratio is incredibly important. I think that's something that a lot of freelancers don't take into account, but it's definitely something that you need to focus on. And ultimately, you want to ask yourself, is the job worth it? You need to evaluate each job individually because every job is different. You can't just have one sort of formula for every job that you look at. Another question that we get asked a lot is, where to find work. So I want to talk about where the real work is. And by real work, I mean work that is good for your career, work that will pay you well, and work that you will be happy doing. In my opinion, and this is based on not only my experience, but the experience of almost every writer I've talked to, the easiest and most lucrative way to make money as a freelance writer is content writing. And I know maybe if you haven't heard that term before, it kind of sounds redundant, but by that we mean, we'll get to a few examples in a minute, but by that we generally mean, writing content for the internet, for websites and blogs and things of that nature. But I think it's important to distinguish that I think the easiest and most lucrative way is content writing and not stuff like, blogging. And by that, I mean starting your own blog and blogging on there, not ebooks, not self-publishing, and not Contentmills, certainly not Contentmills. And I know that a lot of you, your dream is to publish a book or, write poetry or things of that nature and kind of use freelance writing as a vehicle to gain the freedom you need to focus on that work. And for freelance writing, I think the most important focus is on content writing because that's just what will pay the most and what's the easiest. In other words, it has the best cost to benefit ratio. So you might want to consider these types of content writing. There's article writing or blog post writing. They're pretty much the same thing. Just writing articles for different sites and blogs that are out there. Copywriting, such as, copy for websites or ad copy. Social network writing is another one. Those are three of the main ones that you want to focus on, but there are other types of content writing out there as well. And as I said, they pay the most, but they're also the most secure, and that's because content writing is really, really popular right now. And it might seem like there are, not enough jobs to go around, but there definitely are, especially in content writing. So if you've been, trying to, maybe write for magazines or, things of that nature, that's still a good option to take. But in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, it's just going to be more prohibitive than content writing. So if you're having trouble and you're kind of in that sphere of writing for magazines or other publications like that, try to refocus and look to the internet and look at blogs and websites and professionals who are looking for stuff like resumes or copy for their personal website or something like that, because there's always going to be an abundance of jobs in that sphere. Now that we've covered how or what type of work to get, I want to talk about how to effectively and consistently get work, because I think something that I definitely remember is having a hard time really getting good work on a consistent basis. I would get a really good job and it would kind of fuel me, and then I would get a not so good job and I would trudge through it. So I want to talk about the process behind effectively and consistently getting work that will benefit your career. In short, this is all about communicating your value. And I think this is the biggest reason that freelance writers have so much trouble. And that's because, and this is something we're trying to change with Writing Launch, but there's really no sort of one-stop shop for education about freelance writing. You've probably had to learn from, all kinds of sources, experience, random sites on the internet. There probably hasn't been one place where you've gone and gotten all the answers. And like I said, we're trying to change that. But right now, that's not the case. And communicating your value, that lies more in the realm of marketing and business. And so as a result, freelance writers often don't learn that. Even though I think, freelance writers need to focus on business and marketing, that's not something that's, really obvious when you start out. And it's certainly not something that a lot of people will tell you. And the reason that value is so important is because prospects, that is, people or companies who are interested in having you write for them, they think in terms of results. So they're thinking, what benefits are they going to get? That's the question they ask themselves. What benefits am I going to get? That might be more sales or more social shares or whatever. Usually it's more sales, but it can be, any sort of benefit that will help them advance their own career. And I really believe that this is the number one reason why freelance writers do not get to work consistently. I've talked with so many writers who, say, hey, I'm having trouble getting work. I don't really know what I'm doing wrong. I know my writing's good, and the writing is good. And then I look at how they're talking with clients, and they're just, it's very simple. It's not effective. They're basically just saying, hey, I'm interested in the job. Here's my portfolio. But they're not giving the prospect reasons to understand why they're the best person for the job. In other words, they're not selling their value. And every time that I see that, I always tell them, you need to focus on communicating your value. And generally, I hear back excellent and almost immediate results from that. And believe it or not, this is probably why you might not be making as much money as you'd like right now. If you're, having trouble making money with your writing, I'd be willing to bet that it's because you're not communicating your value well enough. And that's no fault of your own. And that's why, we're doing this webinar, in fact, to help you learn how to do that. You have to know what your value is, and then you have to sell it with confidence. And I'll go on a little bit of a tangent for a moment and encourage you to seek out, information about, value in terms of business. So, read up on marketing and sales and learn how to sell a product. You won't really, often need to actually get on the phone and, or go in person and try to, do a sales pitch, but it's good to know those concepts. So we're actually going to do an exercise right now that focuses on finding your value. So if you're watching this right now, or if you're watching the recorded version, if you can follow along, that's great. So get a piece of paper or open a text document, whatever you prefer. And I'll give you a moment to do that. And basically what this exercise is going to be, it's going to be a series of questions to kind of get you started, get you thinking about your value and what you bring to prospects. So once you've gotten whatever you have open, piece of paper on your desk or text document open, I want you to answer these questions. First question, what will your writing do for your clients? It's a simple question, but I think it's one that we don't often ask ourselves. Even as I progress in my career, I have to sort of force myself to ask that question continually because, this might change as you grow your career and go into different niches or focus on, a different aspect of the niche you're in. And this is an important question, For example, like I said a moment ago, will it get them more sales? Will it help grow their readership? These are the questions you want to think about, benefits of that nature. So think about the kind of clients that you take on, think about the niche you're in, think about the goals of your writing. What is the absolute end goal of your writing? What is it going to do? The second question, how will your writing do that? And this is, I think, a trickier question to answer because this is more about the qualities of your writing. And, I think it's funny that for all the writing that we do, I think we often lose sight of what we're actually doing. And that's certainly true for me. Sometimes I focus so much on just getting words on the page that I sometimes forget the goal of what I'm doing, and I have to remember that. So once you're done, and if you're not finished, come back to this later. Turn those answers into a single sentence, and this is going to be your value statement. And this is just something that you can keep around and sort of use just for your own benefit to help you remember what your value is and what you're trying to do. Because keeping this goal in mind is going to be super important for talking with prospects and getting clients and landing jobs. If you lose sight of the value you're bringing, then your pitches are going to be not so great. But if you keep your value in mind, then you're going to have a much better time. So here's a quick example. You could say something like, my website copy helps increase sales by explaining the benefits of the product to users in a compelling way. And I think this exercise is also really useful because it forces you to think about what you're doing and, more importantly, how people are perceiving your writing. I think sometimes writing can become so scientific, and for a lot of us, it might just be going through the same steps over and over again, and we forget to ask ourselves, how is a user on the internet going to read this? What are they going to take away from it? What's it going to do for them? And even before that, you have to ask, what is this going to do for the client? How can I tell my client that I'm, or this prospect that I'm worth, X amount of money and that I'm the right person for the job? So we'll move on from the exercise. Like I said, if you haven't finished, feel free to come back to this later. And I definitely encourage you to and just, keep that little value statement around, maybe write it down on a Post-it note and stick it somewhere or something like that. And always keep that in mind, the value that you bring to your clients. We'll talk some more about communicating your value. Something else that is sort of an extension of the exercise we just finished is to create a value script template. And if you know anything about business practices, that templates can be really, really useful. And at Writing Launch, that's something that we advocate a lot because they save so much time. So this template in particular is part of what you'll send the prospects who are interested in your services. It's almost like a pitch, but it's part of your pitch. And basically, you just want to explain how you're going to bring a value. That's it. And you do want to customize this for each prospect. I think with templates, it's often tempting to just use the same vanilla boilerplate template over and over again and just, put someone's name in at the beginning and then send it off. But if you tweak the entire template for each prospect, and I'm not talking, spending like an hour on this, I'm talking maybe spending 5 to 10 minutes, if that, just making little adjustments to reflect the project at hand. If you do that, you'll have a much higher rate of success because, and this ties in with, pitching for magazines and blogs and things of that nature. If you've done that before, you know that editors love it when a pitch is customized for their publication. And that's the same way for prospects, whether you're talking with an individual professional who needs a resume or a company who wants website copy done, they like it when the pitch is catered to their needs. So I'm going to show you an example template that sort of builds on this. Before I talk about this, I want to direct your attention to the note on the side of the screen on the right side. Do not send this as it is. That's what I recommend. I recommend customizing it and rewriting the entire thing in your own voice. I know it's tempting to say, hey, there's a template here. I can just copy and paste it and, fill in the blanks. It's like Mad Libs, but for working. And I really want to discourage you from doing that and instead encourage you to take this as inspiration and, kind of just rewrite the whole thing. Spend 10, 15, 20 minutes doing this. It'll be a small price to pay for the amount of return on that investment that you'll get. So now that I've made that disclaimer, I'll talk about the actual template itself. And this builds off what we were saying. So, there's a short introduction, and then it launches into, here's what I can do for you. And then you can, throw on like a bullet point list or however you like to talk about your value, and give a few examples of what you can do in terms of the project. So, for example, if you're writing, let's say you're writing website copy for a small business. You want to, say that you'll be able to, get more sales, get more people to visit their website, draw more attention to their product or whatever. It's things like this that you want to be thinking of. And that changes for each project. Like if you're writing ad copy, your goals might be to, appeal to a specific audience, to get them to visit the website and buy a product. If you're, writing a resume, you obviously want to be persuasive and say that, I will make your skills appeal to job recruiters. Those are just a few examples that you might want to be thinking about. And then if you have previous experience and if you've delivered concrete results for people or companies before, that's great to include. So something like, I've previously written for company A and I was able to, get them more sales or whatever it is that you did. And then, you can just go into your fee and then, extend the offer. And this is a rough template, you know what I mean? Because it's not all the time that you'll want to immediately go into your fee and start the job. If the client, hasn't asked about that explicitly, maybe you don't want to include that just yet. So take this more as inspiration and less of an actual template. So now I want to talk about setting rates. This is another big thing, obviously, in growing your writing income, because obviously your rate is what will determine how much income you bring. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think the real power here is that you have the ability to choose your own rate. And this is another way in which I think writers really struggle because of that traditional job narrative, right? So we start at minimum wage, and then someone else above us decides, how much we make. They decide to give us raises, and decide when we can make certain amounts, and if we make less or more, or as each job. Determining what each job entails and how to compensate you for that. But with freelancing, it's you who has the ability to charge whatever you want. You could charge $1,000 for a 500-word blog post. Will people pay it? Maybe not. But the point is, you can charge whatever you want. And so there are some really strategic ways to go about this that I want you to be thinking about. The first one is that if you undervalue yourself, it's going to be really, really hard to recover. If you're starting, and you might be writing right now for, 1 or 2 or 3 cents per word, or even 5 cents per word, or you might be, charging, $15 an hour or whatever your rate is. But you have that feeling that I'm not making enough money right now. And that's generally because most writers undervalue themselves. I rarely see writers who are overvaluing themselves. Because I think a lot of writers are afraid of charging too much, so they err on the side of undervaluing. And I think that's really the wrong approach to take, because it's just so hard to bounce back from that. Even if you're getting consistent work at 5 cents per word, if you suddenly want to make 20 cents per word, then you might lose all of your clients. And that's just sort of a dangerous precedent to set for yourself. So that all starts with a good baseline rate. That's the sort of the foundation you need to build a good income. And if you are, working at that lower rate, you can still recover. It's just going to be more difficult if you have existing long-term clients. So here's what I recommend. If you've been freelance writing for less than 6 months, start at 7-8 cents per word, 7 to 8 cents. And all these prices are in USD. And I wouldn't recommend charging per word, but we'll get to that in a moment. So, 7 to 8 cents per word or whatever, you can work out what that hourly rate is. I know there is if you go to Google and type in a freelance rate calculator, there's I think some website that allows you to figure out what your hourly rate is. So you might want to use that even if you're not going to use your hourly rate, which we'll talk about, I think, on the next slide. But anyway, you want to start at right about 7 to 8 cents per word. And you can obviously, if you want to go lower than this, if you negotiate with a prospect. But I think there are so many writers out there who are charging, like 5 cents per word when they could ask for 15 cents per word and get it. It's just the sort of thing where you'll never know if you don't ask. If you've been freelancing for more than 6 months, I really recommend starting at 10 cents per word. In fact, I consider that to be sort of an industry baseline for what's an okay rate. It's sort of like minimum wage in the freelancing world to me. And obviously, if you're if you're getting a 10 cents per word a rate in a job that's really easy for you to do, and the cost benefit ratio is really good, then you can make a lot of money at that rate. But obviously, you do want to just go higher as much as you can, and we'll be talking about that too. Now I want to talk about how to charge after you've decided how much. Lots of freelancers charge per word or per hour. And I'm a big believer that that's not the right approach to take. When I started out, I was charging per word. I never charged per hour, but I charged per word. I never charged per hour just because I didn't really have the schedule to where I could sit down for hours at a time and toggle how much or use keep track of how much work I had, and like toggle a program on and off to keep track of how much time I was taking. So for me, per word was better, but over time that became less and less the case. And when I was in the early days of Writing Launch, I interviewed a freelancer, a developer, and he talked about charging by project or value-based pricing. And that really got me thinking about how we charge as freelancers. And so my current position, this is what I've thought for a long time now, and what experience has shown me to be successful, is that charging by the project is the most lucrative method. And there are reasons that these other types of charging just don't work the best. Charging per hour is particularly problematic, I think, for freelancers because, how many of us really, sit down for an hour at a time and work nonstop? It generally doesn't happen. And even if you do, it forces you to keep track of your time, and that can get really laborious. And this is something that was pointed out to me by that developer, is that it incentivizes untimeliness. Because if you think about it, an hourly rate best rewards the freelancers who take the longest. And that was a really eye-opening revelation to me, and I had never thought about hourly rates like that before. I knew they were bad, but I didn't really know why. And I think the incompatibility with a freelancing schedule and the fact that it incentivizes untimeliness are two big reasons why I think it doesn't work. And that's become the standard, and that's another way in which the traditional job narrative sort of taints freelancing. Now, charging per word, that's decent. You can still do that, but it can prevent growth. And the reason for this is mostly psychological, because if your clients see that you're charging 5 cents per word, they're gonna lock that in as your rate. And then when you try to change that, there's gonna be some resistance. Whereas if you charge by project, the very nature of charging by projects means that it might change every time. So you can change and even increase your rate, based on the project at hand. So what I recommend doing is finding your per word or your hourly rate, but not using it. You just want to use it to calculate your project rate. So a quick example of that would be if you know your hourly rate. Let's say a client approaches you, or a prospect approaches you and asks you to do website copy for their entire website. And so the way you can calculate that is by, estimating how many hours it's going to take, and you always want to overestimate a bit, not too much because you don't want to rip off your clients, but you want to give yourself some a little padding in case anything goes unexpectedly, and then use your hourly rate to calculate how much the project is going to be. That's a simple example, and you can do the same thing with per word if you want. Hourly rate is a little simpler. Per word, I think, might be more useful for calculating that, but either way, think about that in terms of your project rate. You also need to regularly increase your rates. There are a lot of freelancers who just stay at the same point for years. Or even just months, and that's a long time to be making just the same amount of money and not really seeing an increase. And this is especially important if you start losing work, because if you lose work at a higher price point, it'll be less of you'll suffer less than if you had been charging a lower amount of money. So what I recommend is raising your rates every 6 to 9 months. And this is something you do want to notify your current clients about a month or two in advance. But for new clients, you just act like it's the norm. And, you can modify that timeline. You might want to raise your rates every 6 months or every year. I would say 6 months is about the minimum that I'd go, just because at that point you're dealing with too much fluctuation. But you definitely want to be raising your rates. And it doesn't have to be much. If your currently hourly rate that you're just using for your own internal use is $40 an hour, you might want to just raise it to 50. Or if you've been getting a lot of work, seeing a lot of results, if everything's been going well, you might want to increase it to 60. I think generally the better that you're doing, the more you can get away with raising your rates more. And that's not always true. It is something that you sort of have to feel out, and it's one of those cases in which experience is the best teacher. I won't be able to help you as much as actually going through this process will. But keep that in mind. If you don't increase your rates, you're basically just kind of locking yourself in at the same income level. And I think something else that's interesting is that, at least this is true for me, and it might be true for you too. I tend to get in the trap of thinking of my income as my per word rate or my hourly rate or how much money I'm making in a month. I don't think of it in a very big picture way, and I have to really force myself to think of it like that. Because a $10 an hour increase might not seem like a lot, but that can amount to literally thousands of dollars over the course of a few years. So that's something you want to think about, is really think about your future self and how you want to create that future self. And that's something that a lot of motivational speakers kind of talk about, and I think most of what they say is sort of inapplicable in a real world use, and it's just kind of fluffy. But that, I think there's a lot of truth to it. You want to imagine where you want to be in the future and then do what it takes to get there. And for rates, that means thinking about how much you want to make in X amount of years and then raising your rates until you get there. And you don't want to get too greedy and be out to always just make more and more and more, but you do want to make the most you can to where you're living comfortably, where paying bills isn't a problem anymore, and that's a personal choice, where that goal is. And when you raise your rates, I should note that you may lose some clients. That is definitely a possibility. I don't like sugarcoating things. I like keeping things real. So you may lose a couple of clients, but you'll also be surprised at how many clients you keep and how many clients keep paying you and pay you more. And this ties in directly to value, because if you can convince a client, if your client, like a current client of yours, if they know that your work is great, it's getting the results for them, they like your work, they're going to be willing to pay more to keep you around and keep those benefits around. So think about that as you think about raising your rates. I also want to talk about reducing work, kind of shifting gears a little bit. I talked about this at the beginning of the webinar. Ideally, you want to do the least amount of work while making the most money. If you're familiar with the book, The 4-Hour Work Week, that's sort of the basic idea, right? You want to do as little work as possible while still making the most money. And that can kind of seem like unfair or sort of like you're taking advantage of something, but really I think it's just it's smart, because if you're doing less work, that means you have more time to focus on what matters. If you want to spend more time with your family or travel the world or write a novel or whatever the case may be, you can't do that if you're working, right? If you're putting in 50 hours a week or 60 hours or whatever, you're definitely not going to have time to do the stuff that you love. So you want to cut back on the actual amount of work you're doing and make the most money. And the ratio of work to profit has to be in your favor. That's that cost-benefit ratio we talked about. And you want to consult your hourly rate to determine that profitability, as I mentioned, in conjunction with calculating your project rate. So you want to make sure that basically your cost-benefit ratio is such where the cost is lower than the benefit. And think about that in terms of, is the cost, that is your time, worth the benefit of the money? And you want to just, that's also a case where you sort of have to feel out each project and, determine on an individual basis. One trick to reducing the amount of work that you do is to automate what you can. And that's why I'm such a big fan of templates. I recommend using lots of templates, and in Writing Launch we have several templates that you can take inspiration from or use for yourself. And we really like them just because they save so much time, and you do the work once, and then you can just spend a couple of minutes customizing the templates and you can send them out. So you might want to use templates for pitching, for reaching out to prospects, for emails, whatever the case may be. Figure out where you can use templates and then make use of them, because they're really going to be helpful. And you can also consider software solutions. There are a lot of cool programs out there that will allow you to just do tasks faster. There's programs like Zapier, and If This Then That is a really popular one. And they basically just help you streamline your task management. And focusing on task management is also something that you want to do. You want to make sure that you have an efficient structure in place, and you want to be able to have a routine structure. So if your work days all look different, that's not good. You want to make them look exactly the same. You almost want to have a step-by-step formula to follow, like check email, work on project for X amount of minutes, and stuff like that. And if you're interested in that, I recommend using the Pomodoro technique. So look that up if you're not familiar with it. So to conclude the webinar portion, I want to give you a few challenges. First, I want you to find at least one way to reduce the amount of work you're doing. This can be something as simple as spending less time dealing with email, or whatever the case may be. You want to find just one way to reduce the amount of work you're doing. You can use a program to automate something, whatever. You can create a template for something. Just find one way to do that. Next, I want you to settle on a baseline rate today. If you're having trouble figuring out what to charge, I hope I've helped you with that. But today, what I want you to do is just lock in the rate that you want to make right now. And that's obviously based on how much you need to live and pay your bills and buy food and support your loved ones, or whatever the case may be. I want you to decide that today, or as soon as possible, ideally, and then schedule in a rate increase 6 months from today. Just plan it in right now. Say 6 months from today, you want to be raising your rates by an amount that you can determine the amount now or later, but I just want you to sort of have that in mind, that is going to happen, and I think that will help you get your mental trajectory where it needs to be. And one last thing that I recommend is to print out that value script template. That's the template that I showed on the screen earlier, and I said not to use it as it is, but to customize it. So like take that, write it down, rewrite it in your own voice, customize it a little bit, and then print it out and keep it nearby, and then you can use it as a yardstick for all your jobs. So you can even have it in a document online, so you can just copy and paste it and customize it whenever you need to talk to a client or a prospect. So those are just 3 small challenges that I want you to do today or as soon as possible. If you're watching this in the recorded version, same goes for you today or as soon as possible, because I think these challenges will really get your mind where they need to be. And more importantly, they'll get you started taking action toward the kind of career you want and toward making more money writing. So now we'll move into the Q&A portion. If you have any question about anything that we've covered, ask them in the comments below. You can also email us if you're watching the recorded version. We'll make sure we answer as many questions as we can.
Hi, Ian. We do have a few questions. One question is, if you're working in multiple fields and you're skilled in multiple fields, is it a deterrent to write in this variety of fields, or is it better to stick in just one industry or one niche to continue building your reputation?
That's a fantastic question. There are kind of 2 sides to this, 2 schools of thought. One group says that basically, the more niches you can write in, the more money you'll make just by virtue of being able to write about more things. The other school of thought says that if you, like the question sort of implies, if you stick with one niche and get really known well in it, and if you get really experienced in that, you'll be able to charge more for essentially what is specialist knowledge. And I'm more in that second camp. I think that if you work in as few niches as possible, ideally, 1 or maybe 2, you can get the most money, because then you'll be recognized as an authority in your field. And when it comes to freelance writing, I found that authority and experience are 2 of the biggest determiners of whether or not people will hire you. Obviously, value is first, but experience is close behind, because people want writers who have done work before that's produced real results. So you want to be able to say that you've done that. So that's sort of a tangent, but going back to the question, I definitely think that the fewer niches you write in, the better. Of course, that's sort of something you have to decide for yourself, but that would be my recommendation.
So we have a lot of questions about how to find high-paying clients or clients that are good to work with. One person in particular asked about Craigslist. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, this is something that I probably should have talked about a little bit more, but I'll definitely take this opportunity to do so. First of all, I would definitely not recommend Craigslist at all. I think a lot of freelancers are in the habit of looking in the wrong places, and this is another case in which it's like with Contentmills. As freelancers, we often set our sites too low. So like Craigslist or your local classifieds, those are not where the real jobs are. You want to be looking at job boards, at social network sites. I often recommend Reddit as a really good source of jobs, and this is something we've addressed in past webinars too. So you can go back at those and check those out. But it really is about knowing where to look. I found that job boards that are geared toward freelancing jobs, like there are a couple of job board type newsletters, one from freelancewriting.com, one called the Online Writing Jobs newsletter. There's the Pro Blogger job board. It's things like this, or job boards on social network sites like Reddit. I think that's where I've found the most success. I can't speak to anyone else's success with those. I have heard from other freelancers that that's where they get most of their jobs. You can use sites like LinkedIn to find work, and actually this is kind of ties into what we'll be talking about tomorrow, because one great way to get high-paying clients and to get more work is to actually just do more work for the same clients, and that's what tomorrow's video will kind of address. But one last thing I want to point out about this question is that it really helps to make connections, and it really helps to just become a present figure in the community. So meet other freelance writers, join online communities, be as helpful as you can. I got one of my highest paying jobs. Not actually, I'm sorry, it is my highest paying job. That currently, I make enough money to live off just based on this job alone. I got that because someone on Reddit saw me commenting and offering other freelancers help and said, "Hey, I like what you're about. I appreciate that you're doing that. I think your writing's good. I checked it out. I have a client who needs another writer to do some work. Would you be interested?" And I never, I never had any connection with this person besides, them just seeing my comments on Reddit. So that can be really, really powerful just to build those connections. And it's not even necessarily a matter of getting well known or becoming what we call an influencer in the niche. It's not really about that. It's just about, being part of the community, building connections, and not being afraid to reach out more. And then, like I said, job boards are really useful. Those newsletters, email newsletters I mentioned are really useful. But for places like Craigslist or other classified type ads, I would really stray away from those just because I think there are so many spam jobs that it's just not worth it. It's not worth your time to sort through all of those.
I also want to add that on day 3 of the workshop, I'm going to be covering some case studies, and one in particular I'm really excited about sharing because the writer, she uses such a creative and simple and frankly brilliant way of finding clients that I think a lot of you might be surprised at how straightforward it is, but also how unexpected it is. And that simple technique that she used basically launched her writing career, and she makes a comfortable income from that. So I will be talking about a couple of case studies that serve as good examples about how to go and find clients in your life, and hopefully you'll be able to adapt them to your unique circumstances. So that's on day 3 of the workshop. And I'm really excited about that. I've been collecting all these case studies of how people go out and find these writing gigs, and I find it completely fascinating hearing these stories about how people actually connect. They've been giving me their exact pitches that they've been using to win over jobs. So look for that on day 3. I'm really excited about that. We do have quite a number of more questions. Can you just talk a little bit about define a content mill? And also, someone also asked why you don't like platforms such as Upwork.
Yeah, this actually might be something that we will do a webinar on at some point because I have a lot to say about this topic. I'll keep it really short, but I could talk for probably 3 hours about this. So the first question, what is a content mill? Content mills are basically any site that outsources writing. A few off the top of my head are like, there's one called TextBroker, iWriter, Xerist, sites like these where you basically, you sign up, you have to apply to be a writer, and you get paid really low rates. There's often sort of a hierarchy of rates that is kind of preset for you, and I think Freelancer or Guru might do this. I'm not too sure because I don't use the platforms, but basically they're I think of them as just huge factories full of writers. That's sort of the mental image that I have when I think of a content mill. It's just a huge 1920s industrial style factory with just hundreds and hundreds of writers all clacking away at typewriters and being pressured to work and work and work. And if you visit those sites that I mentioned, TextBroker, iWriter, and Xerist, you'll get a good feel for what a content mill is. And basically, they're all about having you write a lot, and they have really poor quality standards, and you get jobs assigned to you. On some content mills, you even have to bid for your jobs, which I think is just so degrading. But anyway, that's what I would define as a content mill. And then there's freelancing platforms like Upwork and Fiverr, And a freelancer and Guru might fall into this, I think, but Upwork and Fiverr are definitely the most popular. And these are places where you have more control. You can pick the clients you want to work with, but often you have to. You can set your own rate, but you have to be really. You have to really undervalue yourself to even have a chance, because there's always someone from somewhere else that has a lower cost of living who's willing to charge lower than you. So on to why I don't like them. I particularly don't like Upwork. I get when I talk about this with some writers, it can get pretty heated, because people really defend Upwork and platforms like that. They say, oh, they're such a great source of work, and I make a comfortable living off that, and I just have to do it. And my response to that is that you definitely do not have to do it. The main reason why I don't like them is because I don't believe that that's true freelancing, and I don't believe that that is a way to make a career. And I think it's something that some smart entrepreneur thought up and wanted to take advantage of freelancers. Because something that you need to think about is platforms like that, they're a business. What I mean? They're taking a commission from you. That's the second reason I despise freelance platforms. When I was working on a freelancing platform, I was getting a 20% commission taken away from me on every job that I made. So for every $5 I made, I lost $1. And then after that, I had to pay PayPal transaction fees. And back to what I said about that not being true freelancing, the dream, I think, of being a freelance writer is sort of, you might have that sort of image of relaxing on the beach or whatever, or traveling the world. But I think even more realistically, the beauty of freelancing is that you are in charge of your own career. But with sites like that, you're not. There is there's competition right in front of you. If you go into a job board and if you deal with each client individually, they're going to just see you. I mean, they'll probably be talking with other freelancers. There's no doubt about that. But they'll think about you as a service provider more in isolation. Whereas on freelancing platforms, it's harder because there's so much competition, and if you're charging a lot, it's hard for you to communicate your value. And one last point I'll make is that people who go to freelancing platforms to hire writers are there generally because they're looking for cheap writing. I never ever see Upwork or Fiverr recommended as a place to get like really good freelance writing. It's always in conjunction with, do you need cheap writing? If you do, go to Upwork. So yeah, I could talk about that for a long time, but I just basically think that, between the commissions and the fact that, you're kind of catering to the wrong audience, and the fact that you're not totally in charge of your future, all of that to me just leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. And, you want to be your own business model. You don't want to have to depend on someone else's.
A lot of what you're saying has really resonated with me. And I think with this question of where do you go to find writing jobs, really the ideal place you want to go is where there aren't other writers, so that you can stand out and have that more one-on-one relationship with the people hiring you. And if you are seen as separate from all other writers, then it becomes a completely different relationship than if the person hiring you is just deluged with dozens of possible writers who may want to work with them, versus the one writer who builds a relationship over time. So frankly, the best place to find a writing job is where there aren't other writers. And that way you can set the terms of the relationship and get a lot more value out of the relationship, both in terms of money, but also the quality of work you do interacting with your clients and the people you write for is going to be much better if you're pursuing clients outside of the normal channels that all of the other writers are pursuing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. And that's why I'm recommending, not using platforms. And if you can, email a prospect, or get on the phone with them or whatever. I think it's most often email. You can, kind of get them and think of it as a tunnel, if you will, or just, think about meeting them, one-on-one in a room or something like that. It's more like that than, trying to, kind of shout your benefits and, like a marketplace full of other people who are trying to, also do the same thing. And it allows for just more, more of a personal connection and more of a customized connection too.
We've had a few questions about experience. Gabrielle asks, for those of us who are young and are amateur writers, where and how do we gain freelance writing skills?
My recommendation for this is almost always to do a very simple process. Basically, what you want to do is you want to look for blogs that accept guest posts and pitch guest posts until you get 2 to 3 published bylined posts. It's very important that they have your name attached to them as crediting you as the author. If they're paid, that's great. If they're not, that's okay. I generally do not advocate free work, but for this, I think this is like the only time that it's acceptable for you to work for free. And then once you have those, 2 to 3 guest posts, use those as examples to get better work. And it's important that when you do these guest posts, you want to put your everything into them. You want to make them the best that you can possibly make them. And then that quality will shine through. And you really only need a few samples, because the good clients will care more about quality than quantity. And they want good writing that works for them. And if it works for them, they won't really care if it's worked for, it doesn't matter if you've only had, 10 clients or 10,000. It just matters most what they can get out of it. So in short, look for sites that accept guest posts, get 2, 3 published, and then build a portfolio, or just use those as content examples for other jobs. And then once you have those examples, you can go out on job boards or social networks or whatever, and then start pitching your services to other people and other companies.
We have a question from Jamie Graham. She asks, can you give a specific example of how you found a specific client and approached them without using their name?
Can you elaborate on the without using their name part?
Well, I think it's kind of a 2-part question. She's asking about how you approach clients, and then I think, what if you don't know the specific name of the person you're approaching?
Okay, yeah, and that does often happen, especially like if you go on Reddit to find jobs. People have usernames and not their actual name. So I think if you don't know their name, just a simple hi or hello will suffice. I think if people don't give their name, there's no reason that you would know it otherwise. So I don't think that is too big of a deal. And at that stage, I think if you know very little about the job or the client, you want to ask a couple questions. Just ask what are your needs, what are your goals, and then that can sort of shine some light on the process. But as far as specific methods for approaching clients, I think the way that I usually approach it is, if I see like a job posting or someone who's looking for work, I just send them a message or contact them in some capacity and say, hi, I'm interested in helping you out. I'm a freelance writer. I do this sort of work. Here's what I can do for you. It's almost like that that value script template that we talked about earlier. And if I have a few questions to ask, I just ask them, and then it sort of starts a conversation. And I always like to end messages with a question, at least the initial message, because that sort of opens the door for a dialogue. If you just end with hope to hear from you soon, that's not really a commitment. But if you ask a question, that sort of psychologically really suggests that they should at least answer you, even if it's a no. So I hope I answered the question sufficiently enough. If you have any more questions about that, you can always email us, and expound on that. But I think the important thing is to create a dialogue, start a conversation. Don't just say, hey, I'm interested, here are my services. Really go into detail on, the job at hand and how you can do that job at hand and be the best person for the job. Again, talk about the specific results you can bring and the value that you can bring.
Can you go over a few brief places again where you can look for jobs online?
Sure, yeah. The one that I've had most success with is Reddit. And this is, again, a topic that, I could talk about for a long time just because there's so much involved. But basically, the way that Reddit works is that it's broken down into communities that are categorized by niche, and they're called subreddits. And there are two subreddits in particular. One's called Hire a Writer, and the other one is called For Hire. And they've been, for me, really good places to find work. And if you visit Reddit right now, it might look really intimidating, and it might look like sort of not the kind of place that you would expect writing jobs to be. But I've gotten some of my highest paying writing jobs from there. So, just Google, how to use Reddit, learn how to use it, make an account, start participating, start applying for jobs. That's where I'd recommend the most. The second best places are those two email newsletters I mentioned. There's one called, it's called the Morning Coffee Newsletter. It's by freelancewriting.com. And then there's another one that's called the Online Writing Jobs Newsletter. And if you want to get to that, you have to go to online-writing-jobs.com. And by dash, I mean, like a small hyphen, not the backslash. And if you don't use those dashes, you'll get to a content mill. So you definitely want to do the dashes. So online-writing-jobs.com. And they have a newsletter as well. And then the third place I recommend is there's a site called problogger.com, and it has a job board. It has really kind of tanked in quality recently, and I haven't really been happy with that. But there are still, some good jobs. You just have to sort of sift through the bad stuff to get to the good.
I think that's it in terms of the time we have for questions today. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send us an email at support@writinglaunch.com. We're really looking forward to presenting day 2 and day 3 of the workshop. Ian is going to be presenting tomorrow's video, and it's all about getting referrals. And do you want to cover that a little bit?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, tomorrow and the day after, you'll be getting videos that you can watch at any time. And I'm going to be doing tomorrow's video, and that's just going to be on referral templates. So it's going to be a lot of the same ideas we talked about today in terms of getting more jobs and then doing less work to get those jobs. So I'm going to be covering, how exactly to write a referral template, why you need one, how to ask for referrals, because, getting referrals, if you've gotten them before, you know how much power there is to that. It automatically makes you an authority, and you sort of have that, that your foot in the door to a new job already. So I'm really excited to be presenting that, and I think you're going to enjoy it a lot and get a lot of use out of it.
Yeah, and on day 3, I'm going to be presenting some case studies. I've been collecting case studies from freelance writers all over the world who have found good writing gigs, and they've been sending me their stories, and sometimes even including the exact pitches that got their gigs. So I'm going to be presenting a couple of those on day 3, and I'm really excited for that too. So thank you again, everyone, for being here, and we hope you found this quite valuable. And please send us any questions you may have, and we will be sending out the slides pretty soon so you can refer back to them and the exercises that we had today.